The fluorescent lights of the ER ceiling are different from this angle, harsher. As a nurse, you see them as a tool, a sterile sun that banishes shadows so you can find a vein or spot a telltale cyanosis on a patient's lips. But from a gurney flat on your back, they're interrogators. They flicker and hum, buzzing a single accusatory question. How did you end up here? My own colleague swam in and out of focus above me. Sarah, her brow furrowed with a professional worry that couldn't quite mask her personal fear. Dr. Evans, his voice, usually a booming command center in the chaos of Trauma Bay 3, was now a soft murmur somewhere to my left. They were saying things, medical things. Tachycardic at 130. BP is 90/60 and dropping. 5 distinct puncture wounds. Looks like a narrow blade. Let's get another 2 units of O-neg ready. The words were familiar, a language I spoke fluently. But they weren't about a stranger anymore. They were about me. A dull, rhythmic fire pulsed from my abdomen and side, a brutal drumbeat with every shallow breath I took. I tried to ask the question again, the only one that mattered, but my mouth was dry, my tongue a clumsy slab of meat. John Doe? I rasped, the name tasting like ash. Is he? Sarah's face appeared above me, a watery mirage. Shh, Maya, we've got him. He's stable. You need to rest. You're the patient now. You're the patient now. The words echoed in the morphine haze, and suddenly, the sterile hum of the lights dissolved into the shriek of a heart monitor from an hour ago. The shift had been a typical Tuesday grinder. A parade of food poisoning, a dislocated shoulder from a weekend Warriors softball game, and a kid who'd stuck a Lego up his nose. Standard stuff. Then the call came in. Male, mid-40s, fall from a ladder, potential head trauma. We prepped Trauma Bay 3. He came in on a backboard, conscious but dazed. He was an average-looking man, with salt and pepper hair and the kind of soft, unassuming face you'd forget 2 seconds after seeing it. His paperwork listed him as John Doe, no ID on him. He spoke in broken, halting English, his accent vaguely Eastern European. He was scared, not just of the hospital, but of something else. His eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, constantly scanned the entrance to the ER, flinching at every new arrival. I did my work, hooked him up to the monitors, started an IV, did a preliminary neurocheck. His vitals were stable, but his fear was palpable. It radiated off him in waves. You are safe here, I told him, my voice in that calm, practiced cadence we use to soothe panicked minds. He just shook his head, muttering something in a language I didn't understand. That's when they came. 2 of them. They didn't belong. In an ER, you develop a 6th sense for trouble, and these men screamed it. They weren't frantic family members or concerned cops. They wore dark, simple suits that didn't fit the humid city evening, and they moved with a chilling, predatory economy. They bypassed the triage desk, ignored the shouts of the charge nurse, and walked straight towards Trauma Bay 3. Kevin, our biggest security guard, a gentle giant who could palm a basketball, moved to intercept them. Whoa there, guys. Authorized personnel only. The first man didn't even break his stride. There was a blur of motion, a sickeningly soft thud, and Kevin was on the floor, groaning, clutching his knee. The second man was already past him, his eyes locked on my patient, on John Doe. Time seemed to warp, stretching and compressing. I saw the glint of metal in the second man's hand, not a gun, something smaller, sharper. My mind, trained for crisis, cycled through the options in a nanosecond. Hit the panic button, scream for help, run. But my patient was on his back, strapped down, helpless. His pale blue eyes were wide with a terror that was ancient and absolute. He knew these men. He knew what they were here for. My body moved before my brain gave the order. It wasn't a choice, it was an instinct, forged from 1,000 shifts of standing between sickness and health, between life and death. I was the line. I threw myself over him, turning my body into a shield. I braced for impact. The first blow was a sharp, blinding punch of pain in my side. I gasped, the air knocked from my lungs. Then another, higher up, near my ribs, and another, and 2 more in quick succession in my abdomen. It wasn't like the movies. There was no dramatic slicing sound, just brutal, percussive impacts, the sickening feeling of something sharp and hot violating your body. Through the red haze of pain, I heard shouting. The clatter of dropped instruments, Sarah screaming my name. The men were gone as quickly as they had appeared, melting back into the city night. My last thought before my own team swarmed me, before my uniform became soaked in my own blood, was of my patient's terrified face. I had kept the wolves away. For now, just need you to answer a few questions, ma'am. The voice pulled me back to the gurney, back to the interrogator lights. A detective stood beside my bed, a notepad in his hand, and a profound aura of boredom around him. He had a coffee-stained tie and the weary eyes of a man who'd seen too much to be impressed by anything. "It's Tran," I mumbled. "Nurse Tran." "Right, Nurse Tran," he said, not writing it down. "So, these guys, you know them? Was this patient of yours, this John Doe, involved in something? Drugs? Gangs?" I stared at him, bewildered. "What? No, they were professionals. They came for him. They were trying to kill him." He sighed, a long, put-upon sound. "Look, Han, we see this a lot. A deal goes bad, and it spills into a public place. You were very brave, but you probably shouldn't have gotten involved. You're lucky to be alive." My anger, sharp and hot, cut through the morphine. "I'm a nurse. Getting involved is my job. They weren't gangbangers, they were assassins or something. Didn't you see the security footage?" "We're looking at it," he said dismissively. "You get some rest. We'll let you know if we find anything." He clicked his pen and walked away, leaving me alone with the humming lights and the burning in my gut. It wasn't just the physical pain of the wounds. It was a new, colder pain. The sting of being a hero for 5 minutes, only to be dismissed as a naive girl who got in over her head. I closed my eyes, a single, furious tear tracing a path through the grime on my cheek. The system I had just bled for didn't see a protector. It saw a problem. And I had a terrible feeling my problems were just getting started. Morning sunlight, thick with city dust, streamed through the window of my private room, a professional courtesy I would have appreciated more if my insides didn't feel like they'd been rearranged by an angry badger. The night had been a blur of pain meds, fitful sleep, and the relentless beeping of my own IV pump, a sound I usually tuned out but now found deeply, personally irritating. Chloe, my sister, had been by. Her face was a mess of tears and teenage bravado, telling me how badass I was while her hands trembled. Seeing her scared was worse than any stab wound. I'd sent her home with our neighbor, promising I was fine. A lie, but a necessary one. The police detective hadn't returned. No one had. It was as if a bubble of silence had descended around my room. Then, around 9 a.m., the bubble popped. They didn't knock. The door just opened, and 2 men stepped inside. They were a matched set, like bookends for a story you didn't want to read. Both wore identical, perfectly tailored gray suits that seemed to absorb the light in the room. They had on crisp white shirts and muted ties. Their shoes were polished to a mirror shine. No flashy watches, no accessories, just an unnerving, deliberate blankness. The older one, maybe in his late 50s, had iron gray hair cut in a severe military style and a face composed of hard lines and sharp angles. His eyes were the color of a winter sky and held the same chilling emptiness. The younger one was in his 30s, with dark hair and a slightly softer face, but he carried the same stillness, the same coiled tension. "Ms. Tran," the older one said. It wasn't a question. His voice was flat, a monotone that betrayed no emotion. "I am Agent Thorne. This is Agent Miller. We have some questions for you." He gestured vaguely towards his chest, but there was no ID, no badge. "CIA?" I guessed, my voice raspy. My throat felt like sandpaper. It was the only agency that fit the bill of this much understated drama. Thorne's thin lips tightened almost imperceptibly. It was the only confirmation I was going to get. He pulled the visitor's chair over, its legs scraping against the linoleum, and sat down. Miller remained standing by the door, his arms crossed, his posture a study in professional vigilance. "We'd like you to walk us through the events of last night," Thorne began, his gaze unwavering. There was no preamble. "No, how are you feeling?" "No, thank you for your bravery." It was straight to business. I recounted the story, the same one I'd given the detective, but this time I left nothing out: the patient's fear, the attacker's precision, the feeling that this was far beyond a simple street crime. Thorne listened without interruption, his expression unchanging. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment. "What did the asset say to you?" he asked, his voice still a low drone. "The asset? You mean my patient, John Doe?" "Answer the question, Miss Tran." His exact words. He barely spoke English. He said he was scared. He muttered something in another language. I didn't understand it. "Did he give you anything?" Thorne pressed. "A piece of paper? A key? A drive?" He gave me a head injury and a chart full of vitals to monitor. I snarked, the sarcasm a reflex defense against his coldness. I was a little busy trying to keep him and myself from being filleted. Thorne's eyes narrowed. Your flippancy is noted, and unhelpful. You intervened in a matter of national security. Your heroics, as the media is starting to call them, have created a significant complication. I stared at him, my blood running cold despite the warmth of the room. A complication? I had 5 new holes in my body because I'd tried to save a man's life, and this empty suit was calling me a complication. I'm a nurse, I said, my voice low and shaking with a fury that surprised me. My job is to protect my patient. I don't care if he's an asset, a plumber, or the King of England. In my ER, he's my patient. That's it. They, et, d, de. End of, et. For the first time, I saw a flicker of something in Agent Miller's eyes. Respect? Pity? It was gone before I could be sure. Thorne, however, was unmoved. That is a dangerously simplistic worldview, Miss Tran, he said, and it's about to be put to the test. As if on cue, the door opened again. This time, it was Richard Davies, the chief hospital administrator. He was a man who looked like he'd been born in a suit, with slicked-back hair, a toothy, insincere smile, and the predatory eyes of a shark smelling blood in the water. He was flanked by a woman in a severe pantsuit who had lawyer written all over her. Maya, my dear girl, Davies oozed, his smile not reaching his eyes. I came as soon as I heard. What a terrifying ordeal. Simply terrifying. He was lying. He wasn't here for my well-being. He was here for damage control. I knew his type. He cared about 2 things: the hospital's budget and its reputation, and I had just become a massive threat to both. Gentlemen, Davies said, turning to Thorne and Miller with a nod of deference that made my stomach churn. Richard Davies, I trust you're getting everything you need? We're in the process, Thorne said, standing up. The 2 men seemed to understand each other perfectly. They were both managers of complex, messy systems, and I was the unpredictable variable they needed to control. Davies turned his crocodile smile back to me. Maya, in light of this unprecedented security incident and the ongoing investigation, we think it's best for everyone if you take some time off. The hospital is placing you on paid administrative leave, effective immediately. I felt the air leave my lungs. Administrative leave, the corporate equivalent of being sent to the principal's office. It was a punishment, wrapped in the language of concern. Leave? Why? I demanded, trying to sit up, a move I immediately regretted as fire shot through my abdomen. I'm the victim here. Of course you are, my dear, Davies said, his tone dripping with condescension. And we need to conduct a full internal review. Your actions, while well-intentioned, represented a significant departure from standard security protocols. We need to understand how this was allowed to happen on hospital grounds. He was blaming me. Unbelievable. The lawyer, who hadn't said a word, handed me a folder. This just outlines the terms of your leave, she said. You're not to come on hospital property or contact any hospital staff regarding this matter until the investigation is concluded. It's standard procedure. Standard procedure for getting rid of a problem. They were isolating me, cutting me off from my job, my friends, my patient. I looked from Davies's smug face to Thorne's icy stare. They were a tag team from hell, one protecting his institution, the other protecting his mission. And I was caught in the middle, a loose end to be tied up and discarded. You can't do this, I whispered, the fight draining out of me, replaced by a cold, terrifying dread. Thorne gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to Davies. I believe we're done here, he said, then turned to me. We'll be in touch, Miss Tran. He and Miller walked out, as silent and imposing as they had entered. Davies gave me one last pathetic, pitying look. You just focus on getting better, Maya. Let us handle the rest. He closed the door, and the room was silent again. But this time, it was a different kind of silence. It wasn't a bubble, it was a cage. They had thanked me for my sacrifice by taking my job, branding me a liability, and locking me out of the very world I had nearly died to protect. The rage I felt was so pure, so potent, it was almost enough to make me forget the pain. Almost. Being discharged from the hospital should have felt like a liberation. Instead, it felt like an exile. The paperwork was handled with a cold, impersonal efficiency. My attending physician, a man I'd known for years, barely made eye contact. The nurses on the floor, my friends and colleagues, offered tight, fleeting smiles and whispered, "Take care of yourselves," before hurrying away. A memo had clearly gone out. Maya Tran was radioactive, When I tried to use my ID badge to access the staff locker room to get my things, a red light blinked and the lock buzzed angrily. Access denied. A security guard I didn't recognize materialized at my side. Sorry, ma'am. I'll have to escort you out. He looked uncomfortable, but his orders were clear. I was a trespasser in my own workplace. The days that followed were a special kind of hell. I was trapped in my small apartment, my body a prison of aches and pains, the walls closing in. My world, once defined by the controlled chaos of the ER, had shrunk to my living room couch. I'd call the hospital's main line, asking for an update on my patient, John Doe, in the ICU. Each time, I was met with the same line, delivered in a tone of robotic finality. I'm sorry, I can't release any patient information due to HIPAA regulations. HIPAA, the patient privacy law I had championed and defended my entire career, was now being used as a bludgeon against me. The news reports were surreal. They called me a hero, the stab nurse of Metropolitan General. Local channels ran my nursing school graduation photo until I wanted to scream. They spun a simple, clean narrative of bravery. They didn't know about Davies, about Thorne, about the administrative leave. They didn't know the hero of their story was currently trying to figure out if she could afford both her rent and her copay on the mountain of new prescriptions. The isolation was the worst part. My friends from work would send texts, "Thinking of you. Get well soon." But they were short, cautious. No one wanted to talk about what happened. They were scared for their jobs. I couldn't blame them, but it felt like a betrayal all the same. Only Chloe, my 16-year-old sister, was a constant. She'd come home from school, make me terrible microwave dinners, and try to cheer me up with gossip and bad TV, all while pretending not to see the dark circles under my eyes or the way my hands shook when I thought no one was looking. A week after my discharge, Agent Thorne requested another meeting, not at my apartment, but at a sterile, anonymous coffee shop halfway across town. It felt like a scene from a spy movie, which would have been exciting if my life hadn't become one against my will. He was already there when I arrived, sitting in a booth in the back, a cup of untouched black coffee in front of him. He looked just as gray and imposing as he had in my hospital room. "Miss Tran," he said, gesturing to the seat opposite him. "Thank you for coming." "It wasn't a request, was it?" I shot back, sliding into the booth. He ignored the comment. "I wanted to follow up, see how you were recovering." "Save it," I said. "You don't care how I'm recovering. You're here because I'm still a complication." "So what is it? Did you want to threaten me again? Take away my library card this time?" His face remained a mask of stoicism, but I saw a flicker of something annoyance, maybe in his cold eyes. "Your continued obsession with your former patient is unwise. He is being taken care of by the proper authorities." "The proper authorities being you?" I scoffed. "Is he even still at the hospital?" "That is not your concern," Thorne said, his voice dropping a decibel. "What is your concern is putting this behind you, going back to your quiet life, forgetting you ever saw him, forgetting you ever saw me." The threat was no longer veiled. It was laid bare on the Formica tabletop between us. "I can't do that," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "A man's life is at stake." Thorne leaned forward slightly, the first real movement I'd seen him make. "You have a very narrow view of the world, Miss Tran. You see one life. I see a global chessboard. Sometimes a pawn must be sacrificed to protect the king. You are interfering with the game." "He's not a pawn. He's a person. And I'm his nurse." A long, heavy silence fell. Thorne picked up his coffee cup, studied the black liquid inside, and set it down. When he looked back at me, his eyes were completely devoid of warmth. "You have a sister," he said. The words were simple, factual. My blood turned to ice. "Don't you dare." "Chloe, isn't it? A sophomore at Northwood High. She runs track, likes art. She's a good kid by all accounts." He knew her name. He knew her school. He knew her hobbies. "You stay away from her," I snarled, my voice a low growl. "I have no interest in your sister," Thorne said smoothly. "But other agencies might. You know, it's a world full of paperwork and protocols. Things get flagged for all sorts of reasons. A guardian who is the subject of a major federal investigation. A guardian who associates with dangerous individuals and is the victim of a violent crime that tends to raise flags with certain departments. Child Protective Services, for instance. They have their own checklists, their own mandates. It would be a tragedy if they were to determine that your home environment has become unstable." He let the words hang in the air, each one a perfectly crafted dart of poison. He wasn't just threatening my job anymore. He was threatening the one thing in the world that mattered to me. He was threatening to take my sister. This was the apex of their cruelty, the masterstroke of rage bait. To use my love for my sister as a weapon against me. The sheer, calculated evil of it left me breathless. For the first time, I felt a tremor of real fear. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly. The few other patrons in the coffee shop glanced over. "You're a monster," I whispered, my voice thick with a mixture of hatred and terror. Thorn didn't flinch. "I'm a patriot, Miss Tran. I do what is necessary to protect my country. You should consider doing what is necessary to protect your family." I walked out of that coffee shop, leaving him with his cold coffee and his colder soul. The city streets seemed hostile. Every passing car a potential threat. Every stranger a possible spy. He had squeezed, and squeezed hard. He expected me to break. That night, unable to sleep, I made a call. Dr. Ben Carter, my old mentor at the hospital, picked up on the third ring. His voice was wary. "Maya, is everything okay?" "No," I said, keeping my voice low so I wouldn't wake Chloe. "Ben, I need your help. I know you're scared. I know what Davies is telling everyone, but they're trying to destroy my life. They're threatening my sister." I heard him sigh on the other end of the line. The sound of a good man caught in a bad situation. "What do you need, Maya?" "My patient, John Doe. Is he still there?" There was a long pause. "Yes," he finally said, his voice barely a whisper. "He's in the cardiac ICU. Top floor. Under guard. They're saying he developed a heart condition post-op. It's nonsense. His chart is pristine. They're holding him, stalling for something." It was the confirmation I needed. Thorn was lying. Alexei was still a pawn on the board, and his time was running out. "Thank you, Ben," I said, relief washing over me. "You're a good man. Be careful, Maya," he warned. "These people don't play games." "I know," I said, hanging up the phone. "Neither do I." Thorn and Davies thought they had me cornered. They thought fear was the ultimate motivator, but they had miscalculated. They had squeezed so hard, they hadn't broken me. They had compressed all my fear and desperation and grief into a single, sharp point of diamond-hard resolve. The days after Thorn's threat were a blur of calculated calm on the outside and a raging storm on the inside. I went through the motions for Chloe, making breakfast, asking about school, pretending to be absorbed in daytime television. I needed her to believe everything was normal, that her world was still secure. But every time the phone rang, my heart hammered against my ribs. Every unfamiliar car that parked on our street sent a jolt of paranoia through me. My apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt like a glass cage. I sat on my couch one evening, surrounded by a mountain of paperwork. There were the letters from the hospital, full of cold, legalistic language about my administrative leave. There were the medical bills, already arriving in a flood of crisp, white envelopes, each one a reminder of the physical and financial cost of my heroics. On the coffee table was a framed photo of me and Chloe at the beach last summer, laughing, our faces bright with sun and uncomplicated joy. I stared at that photo, at Chloe's carefree smile. Thorn had tried to turn that love into a lever, a tool to control me. He thought he was showing me my weakness. But as I sat there, the weight of everything pressing down on me, I realized he had actually shown me my strength. He had shown me exactly what I was fighting for. It wasn't just for a nameless patient anymore. It was for the simple, beautiful life captured in that picture. It was for the right to live without fear, without looking over my shoulder, without being bullied into submission by men in gray suits. My despair began to burn away, leaving something harder and hotter in its place: righteous anger. I had taken an oath when I became a nurse. It wasn't just some symbolic recitation. It was a promise. I will advocate for the health and safety of my patient. There was no asterisk at the end that said, unless a government agency tells you to back off. There was no clause that said, unless it threatens your job or makes your life difficult. The oath was absolute, and my patient, Alexei Volkov, was still in danger. My path was clear. I couldn't outmuscle them. I couldn't outspy them. But I had a weapon they didn't have and couldn't understand. I was a damn good nurse. I knew the system, the real system, the one made of protocols, paperwork, and procedures inside and out. The hospital was my battlefield, and I knew its terrain better than anyone. Thorn and Davies saw the hospital as a building to be controlled. I saw it as a complex organism, with arteries and veins, a nervous system of rules and regulations, and I knew how to exploit it. Just as I was mapping out the hospital's floor plan in my mind, my burner phone buzzed. It was a cheap, prepaid flip phone I'd bought for cash the day after Thorn's visit. The number was blocked. My hand trembled as I answered. Hello? Miss Tran. The voice was rushed, tense. It was Agent Miller. I don't have much time. Agent Miller? What's going on? Listen to me, he said, his words clipped. Thorne is making his move. He's finalizing a deal. They're handing your patient back over to the people he escaped from. It's a diplomatic trade. A messy problem gets swept under the rug. He's arranged a private medical transport for tomorrow night. 2,200 hours. It's being logged as a transfer to a long-term cardiac care facility upstate. It's a lie. My blood ran cold. They're going to kill him. They're going to take him somewhere he'll wish he was dead. Miller corrected, his voice grim. Thorne considers it a clean solution. I don't. What you did in that ER, it was right. No one else will say it, but it was. Why are you telling me this? I asked, my heart pounding. You're risking your career. Let's just say I still believe in what my job is supposed to be, he said. I can't intervene directly. I'm being watched. But Thorne, in his arrogance, has gotten sloppy. He's using a private contractor for the transport, and he's pushed the paperwork through on his own authority, bypassing the hospital's standard transfer committee. It's a procedural weakness. A big one. A procedural weakness. The words lit up in my brain like a beacon. The transport is scheduled to depart from the North Wing ambulance bay, Miller continued. That's the one they use for low-priority discharges. He thinks it will be discreet. He paused. I've arranged for a legitimate ambulance, a different one, to be at the South Wing discharge bay at 2,215 for a routine patient transfer that doesn't exist. The driver is a man I trust. That's all I can do. The rest is up to you. Thank you, I whispered, my mind already racing, piecing together the puzzle. A procedural weakness. A fake ambulance. A window of opportunity. Don't thank me. Just be careful, Miss Tran, he said. Thorne doesn't like losing. The line went dead. I stood in the quiet of my apartment, the phone still pressed to my ear. Miller had given me the key. Thorne and Davies thought they could control the hospital with guards and threats. They were amateurs. I was about to show them what real control looked like. I pulled out a notebook and began to write. It was a plan born of desperation and fueled by a nurse's intimate knowledge of her world. I knew every hallway, every supply closet, every blind spot in the security camera coverage. More importantly, I knew the language. I knew the magic words that could bend the hospital's rigid rules to my will. Words like stat, code, pulmonary embolism, and patient deteriorating. Thorne saw Alexei as a pawn on a chessboard. Davies saw him as a liability on a balance sheet, but they were both wrong. He was my patient, and the game was about to change. The minutes before 9 p.m. the next night were the longest of my life. I sat in my car in a parking garage across the street from Metropolitan General, the hospital's massive, illuminated facade looking like a fortress. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I wore a set of clean, anonymous gray scrubs I'd kept in my gym bag, a stethoscope draped around my neck like a talisman. My hair was pulled back in a severe bun, my face pale and grim in the rearview mirror. I looked like a nurse heading into a war zone, which wasn't far from the truth. At exactly 21:05, I called Dr. Carter. Ben, it's time, I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. Maya, this is insane, he whispered back. He was already in his office at the hospital. I know, but it's happening. Are you ready? I heard him take a deep breath. Ready as I'll ever be. The login is open on my desktop. Okay. On my signal. I took one last look at the hospital, then started the engine. The plan was in motion. There was no turning back. Phase 1. The Trojan Horse. I didn't go through the main entrance. I used the side entrance for the outpatient physical therapy clinic, which I knew had less security after hours. I swiped a spare ID card from a resident. I was friendly with one I'd borrowed months ago to let myself into the lounge for good coffee. It was a long shot, but the system was old. The light flashed green. I was in. I moved through the quiet, darkened hallways, my rubber-soled shoes making no sound. It was eerie being in the hospital as an intruder, a ghost in my own home. My destination was a small, forgotten nurses' station on the 4th floor, equipped with an old computer terminal that was rarely used. I pulled out my burner phone and texted Ben. Now. A moment later, he replied, Done. Good luck. Using the remote desktop app I'd had him install on his computer earlier that day, his screen appeared on my monitor. I had his credentials, his authority. I navigated to the hospital's internal alert system. With trembling fingers, I typed out the message that would set the entire gambit in motion. From the cardiac ICU station, I sent a stat page to the on-call rapid response team, flagging Alexei Volkov's room. The diagnosis: suspected massive pulmonary embolism. Patient is tachycardic, SATs dropping to 85%. Requesting immediate stat spiral CT scan. A pulmonary embolism, a blood clot in the lungs, was the perfect medical lie. It was sudden, life-threatening, and required immediate action. It created a legitimate panic-inducing reason to move my patient, an emergency that would override almost any other protocol. Thorne's men were guards, not doctors. They wouldn't know a PE from a peanut butter sandwich. They would have to defer to the medical professionals. To me, Phase 2, the confrontation. I took the service elevator up to the 10th floor, the cardiac ICU. As the doors opened, I could already hear the controlled chaos my page had unleashed. Nurses and doctors were hurrying towards Alexei's room. I slipped into the scrum, my gray scrubs making me anonymous, my purposeful stride making me look like I belonged. Two of Thorne's men stood outside Alexei's door, looking confused and alarmed by the sudden influx of medical staff. They were big, but they were out of their element. I pushed past them. "Excuse me, I'm with the response team." Inside, a young resident was already at Alexei's bedside, trying to make sense of the perfectly normal readings on the monitor. Alexei himself looked pale and terrified. "What's going on?" the resident asked me, bewildered. "His vitals are stable." "Monitors can lie," I snapped, switching into full-on ER nurse mode. I was just on the phone with his primary cardiologist. "Based on his post-op condition, we can't risk it. We need that scan now. Prep him for transport." Before anyone could argue, Richard Davies burst into the room, his face a mask of fury. "What in God's name is happening here? This patient is not to be moved." I turned to face him, my expression a perfect blend of urgency and professional indignation. "Mr. Davies, this patient is showing classic signs of a PE. If he throws a clot and codes in this bed, the liability will be astronomical. As the senior nurse on this response, I am ordering an immediate transfer to CT for a life-saving diagnostic scan. Are you, a non-medical administrator, countermanding my clinical judgment?" I had him. I was using his own favorite weapon liability against him. He sputtered, his eyes darting from me to the monitors to the resident. He was trapped. If he stopped me and something did happen, his career would be over. Every second we waste arguing, the clot could be moving to his heart. I pressed, my voice ringing with authority. "Do you want to take responsibility for that, Mr. Davies? Do you want to sign the AMA form, releasing the hospital from all responsibility when his family sues?" He blanched. He was a creature of the boardroom, not the ICU. In this world, my word was law. "Fine," he snarled. "Do it! But you will be held accountable for this." Phase 3. The escape. We were moving. I was at the head of the gurney, steering it out of the room. Thorne's men, now joined by a third, looked to Davies, who just waved them on, his face tight with anger. They fell into step around us, a reluctant, confused honor guard. "Standard procedure is to take the main elevator to imaging on the 2nd floor, the resident said. "No time," I barked. "We'll take the service elevator at the end of the hall. It's faster." It wasn't faster, but it was the route I needed. As we entered the cavernous concrete service corridor, the polished gleam of the hospital gave way to stark functionality. I could hear the agents muttering into their sleeves, no doubt reporting the situation to Thorne. Time was running out. As we approached a junction, I saw Dr. Carter at the far end of the intersecting hallway. He gave me a slight, almost imperceptible nod, then slammed his hand down on a fire alarm pull station. The hallway was instantly filled with the deafening clang of bells and the flash of strobing lights. Chaos erupted. Fire doors began to slide shut. "This way!" I shouted over the din, making a sharp right turn, away from the CT lab, away from my supposed destination. In the confusion, with the strobing lights and blaring alarms, Thorne's men hesitated for a split second. It was all I needed. I pushed the gurney with all my might, careening down a ramp that led to the hospital's laundry and supply wing. The resident, realizing what was happening, gave me a wide-eyed look and then, to my eternal gratitude, peeled off and ran in the opposite direction, adding to the confusion. Alexei, strapped to the gurney, looked up at me, his eyes filled with a dawning understanding. We raced through a maze of corridors, past giant rolling bins of linens and shelves stacked high with medical supplies. I could hear the heavy footfalls of the agents behind us getting closer. They were shouting now, their professional cool shattered. I saw the exit ahead, the south wing discharge bay. The doors slid open to the cool night air. And there it was, a single ambulance, its lights off, waiting patiently. Miller's man. I pushed the gurney the last few feet, my lungs burning, my sides screaming in protest. The driver, a man with a calm, steady face, jumped out and helped me load Alexei into the back. "Go!" I yelled, slamming the doors shut. "Go now!" Just as the ambulance's tires screeched out of the bay, Thorne himself rounded the corner, his face a thunderous mask of pure rage. His agents were right behind him. They were too late. I stood there, panting, my hands on my knees, the adrenaline starting to recede, leaving a profound, bone-deep exhaustion in its wake. I was surrounded, trapped, but I didn't care. I looked up at Thorne, met his furious gaze, and I smiled. It wasn't a triumphant smile. It was the weary, satisfied smile of a nurse who had done her job. My patient was safe. I had won. The silence in the ambulance bay was absolute, broken only by the fading wail of a distant fire alarm and my own ragged breathing. Thorne stood 10 feet away, his impeccably tailored suit now looking slightly rumpled, his face a frozen portrait of fury. For the first time since I'd met him, the mask had slipped. He wasn't a cold, calculating agent of the state. He was just a man who had been outmaneuvered, and he hated it. "You have no idea what you've done," he said, his voice a low, dangerous hiss. "I know exactly what I've done," I panted, straightening up, forcing my exhausted body to stand tall. "I upheld my oath. You should try it sometime." His agents fanned out, their expressions grim. I expected to be thrown to the ground, handcuffed, dragged to some dark, windowless room. But Thorne just stared at me, his mind clearly racing, calculating the fallout. He knew the ambulance was gone. He knew Alexei was in the wind with a journalist. The game was over, and he had lost. Creating a public scene by arresting a heroic nurse on hospital grounds would only make it worse. He gave a curt, almost invisible shake of his head to his men. "We're done here," he said, the words tasting like poison in his mouth. He turned and walked away without another word, his agents falling into formation behind him, leaving me alone in the cool night air. The next 24 hours were the quiet before the storm. I went home, my entire body shaking with post-adrenaline fatigue. I hugged Chloe so tightly she complained I was crushing her. I fell into bed and slept for 14 hours straight. When I woke up, the world had changed. The story was everywhere. It wasn't on the local news anymore. It was the lead story on CNN, on BBC, on every major news network across the globe. The headline was explosive. Foreign intelligence analyst defects to West, alleges massive corruption scandal, survives assassination attempt on U.S. soil. The journalist from the ambulance had done his job. Alexei Volkov, no longer John Doe, had given his testimony from a secure, undisclosed location. He laid out a complex web of international money laundering, espionage, and political assassinations, all backed by the documents on the flash drive Miller had given me. The story of his dramatic escape from a major U.S. hospital, aided by a whistleblower nurse, was the cinematic detail that made the story irresistible. The blowback was immediate and catastrophic for my enemies. A formal inquiry was launched into the CIA's handling of the Volkov case. Agent Thorne, for losing a high-value asset and nearly precipitating an international crisis through a secret, unsanctioned deal, was quietly but decisively forced into early retirement. His career didn't end with a bang, but with the quiet rustle of a termination letter. Agent Miller, I later heard through back channels, was given a medal by a rival faction within the agency for his role in preventing a disaster and securing Volkov's intelligence. At Metropolitan General, the implosion was even more spectacular. The board of directors, facing a public relations nightmare of biblical proportions, convened an emergency meeting. When the details of Richard Davies' conduct came to light, his blaming of a heroic employee, his complicity with the CIA's cover-up, his threats he was unceremoniously fired, his smarmy face was on the news for a day, a symbol of corporate malfeasance, before he disappeared from public life. My phone, both my real one and the burner, started ringing off the hook. Lawyers, television producers, book agents. The hospital's new interim CEO called personally. He apologized profusely and offered me my job back, with a promotion to head nurse of the ER, a significant raise, and a public commendation. I met him in his office a week later. It was the same office where Davies had decided to ruin my life. It felt good to be there on my own terms. "We're deeply sorry for how you were treated, Maya," the CEO said, his sincerity seemingly genuine. What you did was extraordinary. We want you back. The staff, the city, they see you as a hero. I looked out the window at the city skyline. A week ago, it had seemed hostile and threatening. Now, it just looked like home. Thank you, I said, turning back to him. I appreciate the offer, but I can't accept. He looked stunned. But why? This is your hospital. It was, I corrected him gently. But what I learned through all of this is that the system isn't just broken in the CIA, it's broken everywhere. In corporations, in hospitals. It's a system that protects itself first, and people second. I can't go back to just treating the symptoms in the ER. I want to help fix the disease. I walked out of that hospital for the last time, not as an exile, but as a free woman. With the substantial settlement the hospital offered me to avoid a lawsuit, and the platform my newfound fame had given me, I started a nonprofit, the Patient Advocacy Foundation. We fight for people who get chewed up by the healthcare and insurance industries, for patients who don't have a voice, for nurses who are punished for doing the right thing. Months have passed. The media frenzy has died down. My life has found a new, better normal. The scars on my abdomen have faded to pale, silvery lines, reminders of a battle I didn't ask for but was proud to have fought. This evening, Chloe and I were sitting at the kitchen table, arguing over her calculus homework. It was a perfectly normal, beautifully mundane moment. The mail was on the counter, and I idly sorted through it. Bills, junk mail, a magazine, and one other thing. A postcard. There was no return address. The picture on the front was of a brilliant sunrise over a calm turquoise sea. It could have been taken anywhere in the world. I flipped it over. The postmark was smudged, unreadable. There was no long message, no signature. Just 2 words, written in a neat, careful hand. Thank you. I smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached my eyes. I tacked the postcard to the corkboard in our kitchen, right next to the photo of me and Chloe at the beach. A reminder of the life I had fought to protect and the one I had saved. The world was still full of monsters and bureaucrats and men in gray suits, but it was also full of sunrises. And for the first time in a long time, I felt truly, completely safe.